My life was one of quiet order, a carefully curated collection of predictable moments. I live in a small but sunny apartment in the city, filled with more books than furniture, and I work as an archivist for the city's historical society. My days are spent in the hushed scent of aging paper and leather, piecing together the stories of people long gone. It was a peaceful existence, one I had built for myself, far from the polished, sterile world of my father and his second wife. I believed my family history was simple: a mother who passed away too young and a paternal grandfather who, according to my father, had died tragically abroad before I was born. But a single piece of mail, sent from halfway across the world, was about to prove that the most important story of my life was the one I had never been told. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Chapter 1: An Ordinary Life, An Extraordinary Letter. The day it all began was aggressively, painfully normal. A Tuesday in October. The air outside my apartment window held the crisp, melancholic scent of autumn, and the sky was a muted, indifferent gray. I was cataloging a collection of letters from a 19th-century merchant, my fingers tracing the delicate, spidery script, completely absorbed in a world that was not my own. That was my comfort zone, the past. The past was fixed, its stories complete. It couldn't lie to you. Or so I thought. My relationship with my father, Mark Carter, was similarly fixed, but far from comfortable. It was a thing of scheduled phone calls and holiday dinners where the silence was more eloquent than the conversation. He was a successful financial advisor, a man who measured the world in profit margins and assets. His wife, Susan, was an interior designer whose aesthetic was expensive minimalism, a style that seemed to extend to her emotional range. They lived in a glass house in the suburbs that felt more like a showroom than a home. I had stopped trying to find a place for myself there years ago. My world of dusty archives and quiet contemplation was, to them, a charming but ultimately unimpressive hobby. They wanted me to be ambitious, to be a Carter. I just wanted to be Lily. My father's story about his own father, Samuel Blackwood, was a cornerstone of my childhood. He would tell it with a practiced somberness, usually after I'd asked about my mother's side of the family, a topic he always deflected. My father was a brilliant man, he'd say, swirling a glass of wine. An innovator. But he went abroad for a business deal, somewhere in Europe, and there was an accident. A terrible, tragic accident. He was gone before he ever got a chance to meet you. It was a neat, tidy story. A closed book. I never had a reason to question it. I mourned a man I'd never met, a ghost in my family tree. That Tuesday, I came home from work, dropped my keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, and sifted through the mail. Bill's junk mail, a postcard from a friend. And then, I saw it. An envelope, thick and made of heavy, cream-colored paper. It felt alien amongst the flimsy commercial mail. There was no return address, only a series of unfamiliar postage stamps from Switzerland. My name and address were written on the front in a shaky but elegant hand, the ink a deep, classic black. Curiosity, sharp and sudden, pierced through my end-of-day fatigue. I slid it open with my thumb, a strange sense of reverence settling over me. Inside was a single, folded sheet of the same expensive paper. As I unfolded it, my eyes caught the name at the bottom first, and my breath hitched. Samuel Blackwood. It had to be a mistake. A cruel joke. I read the letter from the beginning, my heart starting to pound a frantic, unsteady rhythm against my ribs. My dearest Lily. If you are reading this, it means that my attempts to reach your father have failed, and my lawyer, Mr. Chen, has succeeded in finding you directly. I can only imagine the shock this letter must bring, as I have been led to believe that, to you, I have been dead for over 20 years. I am not dead, child. I am very much alive, though I am an old man now. I live in a small town near Lake Geneva. The truth is, your father did not lose me to an accident. He left me here. He convinced me to transfer my assets into his management, citing my failing health, and then he simply disappeared from my life. He told the world I had passed away, and he left me in a foreign country with limited resources and no one to turn to. I am writing to you not for pity, but for help. Your father has systematically cut me off, and I fear he is now making moves to liquidate the last of my legacy, a legacy I always intended for you. I am not the destitute man he likely wishes I was, but I am isolated. My health is failing, and I am running out of time. I do not know what lies he has told you, but I implore you, come and find me. Let me tell you the truth myself. Yours, with hope, your grandfather, Samuel Blackwood. I read the letter 3 times. The words blurred, then sharpened, then blurred again. My legs felt weak, and I sank onto the floor, my back against the wall. The quiet order of my world had just been shattered. Every memory, every story my father had told me, fractured and reassembled itself into something monstrous. The tragic accident. The somber tone. The closed book. It was all a lie. A deliberate, cruel, 20-year-long lie. My grandfather wasn't a ghost. He was a prisoner. And my father was his jailer. A cold, furious clarity washed over me. I wasn't just an archivist of other people's histories anymore. I had to uncover my own. The letter felt like a hot coal in my hands. For a few hours, I did nothing but sit on my floor, the quiet of my apartment amplifying the roaring in my ears. The man who had raised me, who had provided for me, who had at least feigned paternal affection at birthdays and holidays, was a liar on a scale I couldn't comprehend. He hadn't just lied about an inheritance or a small family secret. He had erased a living person. His own father. By morning, the shock had cooled into a hard, dense ball of rage in my stomach. I knew what I had to do. I called in sick to work, my voice sounding hollow and distant to my own ears. Then, I called my father. Dad, I said, my voice tight, I need to see you. Today. It's urgent. There was a pause. I could almost hear him mentally scanning his schedule for a slot to fit in his eccentric daughter. Lily, I'm swamped. Can it wait until the weekend? No, I said, the single word like a shard of ice. It can't wait. I'll come to your office. The finality in my tone must have registered, because he sighed and agreed, telling me to be there at noon. Walking into my father's office building was like entering another world. It was all polished marble, silent elevators, and hushed, important-sounding conversations. His office was on the top floor, a corner suite with a panoramic view of the city I called home. He was standing by the window when I walked in, a portrait of success in a tailored suit. Susan was with him, perched elegantly on a leather sofa, flipping through a magazine. Her presence felt like a deliberate buffer. A second line of defense. Lily, darling, Susan said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. What's this all about? You sounded so dramatic on the phone. My father turned, his expression a carefully managed mixture of concern and impatience. Is everything all right, Lily? He asked. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I walked to his expansive mahogany desk, my hands shaking slightly, and placed the letter from Switzerland on the polished surface. I got this in the mail yesterday, I said, my voice trembling but clear. I think you'll want to read it. He picked it up, his brow furrowed in confusion. As his eyes scanned the page, I watched the mask of the calm, successful financial advisor begin to crack. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy sheen. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the paper. Susan, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stood up and walked over, peering over his shoulder. Her gasp was sharp and audible. What is this? My father finally managed to say, his voice a hoarse whisper. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sort of feral panic. It's a joke. A scam. Someone is trying to extort us. A scam? I shot back, my voice rising with disbelief. It's postmarked from Switzerland. It's signed by Samuel Blackwood. Or did you forget his name? The name hung in the air between us, heavy and accusatory. Susan placed a hand on his arm. Mark, calm down. She doesn't understand. Oh, I think I'm finally starting to, I said, my gaze locked on my father. All those years. All those stories about the tragic accident. You told me he was dead. You told me you mourned him. How could you? My father tossed the letter onto the desk as if it had burned him. He straightened his tie, a pathetic attempt to regain composure. You don't know the whole story, Lily. My father, he was a difficult man. Mentally unstable in his later years. He was losing his grip on reality. I did what I had to do to protect him, to protect the family legacy. It was the classic gaslighter's defense, paint the victim as crazy. Protect him? I practically shouted, the sound echoing in the sterile office. You left him in a foreign country. You cut him off and told the entire world he was dead. That's not protection, that's a prison sentence. Susan stepped forward. Lily, your father loved him very much. This was the hardest decision of his life. Samuel was becoming a danger to himself. He was making erratic financial decisions. Mark stepped in to preserve the estate that you, one day, stand to inherit. The mention of the inheritance was so crass, so transparently manipulative, that it made me feel sick. They saw this as a transaction. A problem of assets, not a human being. I don't care about the inheritance. I yelled, tears of rage finally spilling over. I care about the fact that I have a grandfather who is alive, a grandfather who thinks he's been abandoned, because his own son decided to bury him alive to get his hands on his money. My father's face hardened, the panic replaced by a cold fury. The mask was gone. I was finally seeing the man underneath. You have no idea what you're talking about, he seethed, his voice low and dangerous. You've lived a sheltered life, playing with your dusty old books, funded by the very legacy I have worked tirelessly to protect. I made a tough call. It's what men in my position have to do. He is an old man who has lost his mind, and you are a naive girl who has fallen for the ramblings of a senile stranger. That was the moment I knew there was no reaching him. There was no remorse, no guilt. Only the cold, hard logic of a predator. He had made a calculated decision 20 years ago, and he would stand by it. He saw his father not as a person, but as a liability to be managed. And he saw me as a fool. I'm going to find him, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, but filled with a conviction that surprised even me. I'm going to Switzerland, and I'm going to find my grandfather. Susan scoffed. Don't be ridiculous, Lily. You can't just up and leave. But my father just stared at me, a flicker of genuine fear in his eyes for the first time. He knew I meant it. If you do this, he said, his voice a clear threat, you are on your own. You will be cutting yourself off from this family. Do you understand me? I looked at him, at the man I had called my father my entire life, and I felt nothing but a profound, aching emptiness. What family? I asked softly. From where I'm standing, you destroyed it 20 years ago. I turned and walked out of the office, the silent elevator ride down feeling like a descent into a new, terrifying reality. The lie was exposed. Now, the search had to begin. Leaving my father's office, I felt as though I had stepped out of my own life and into someone else's. The city streets, once familiar and comforting, now seemed alien. Every stranger I passed held the potential for a secret history, a hidden life. My own history, which I had always considered so simple, had become a complex, dark mystery. The first thing I did was go home and book a flight to Geneva. It was a reckless, impulsive act, fueled by adrenaline and anger, but it felt like the only real choice I could make. The letter provided a crucial clue, a name. Mr. Chen, the lawyer. There was no contact information, but the name was distinctive. I spent the next 24 hours in a frenzy of research. I used my skills as an archivist, not to trace 19th century merchants, but to hunt for a 21st century lawyer in Switzerland. I scoured online legal directories, cross-referencing names with locations near Lake Geneva. After hours of dead ends, I found him, a Mr. David Chin, specializing in estate law, with an office in a small, discreet firm in Geneva. I sent him a scanned copy of the letter and a brief, desperate email explaining who I was. His reply came within hours. It was professional, cautious, but undeniably encouraging. He confirmed he worked for Mr. Blackwood and that he had indeed been tasked with finding me as a last resort. He provided an address for my grandfather in a town called Montreux, a place known for its jazz festival and its serene lakeside promenade. He also offered to meet me upon my arrival to brief me further. A small flame of hope ignited within me. I wasn't entirely alone in this. 2 days later, I was on a plane, crossing the Atlantic. I had packed a single suitcase, told my work I was taking an emergency family leave of absence, and ignored the barrage of calls and texts from my father and Susan. Each buzz of my phone felt like an attempt to pull me back into the web of their lies, and I refused to let them. During the long flight, I reread my grandfather's letter until the paper softened at the edges. I tried to imagine him. What did he look like? What had his life been like for the past 2 decades, living in forced exile while his son pretended he was a ghost? Landing in Geneva was a surreal experience. The air was clean and cool, and the distant sight of snow-capped mountains was both beautiful and intimidating. David Chen met me at the airport, just as he had promised. He was a man in his early 60s, with a calm demeanor and kind, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through my exhaustion and anxiety. He looked more like a university professor than a high-powered lawyer. "Miss Carter," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "I am so glad you came. Your grandfather has been waiting a very long time." Over coffee in a quiet airport cafe, he filled in some of the gaps. "Your father, Mark, convinced Samuel to move to Switzerland for a rest cure about 22 years ago," he explained, his voice measured and calm. Samuel had just recovered from a minor heart attack, and Mark used it as leverage. He claimed the stress of running the company was too much. He set him up in a lovely villa in Montreux and was given power of attorney to manage his affairs. At first, David continued, Mark visited, he called. But the calls became less frequent. The visits stopped. Then, Mark informed the clinic staff and the few local contacts Samuel had made that his father's cognitive decline was rapid. He used that as an excuse to isolate him completely, managing all his correspondence, blocking calls. When Samuel realized what was happening, it was too late. Mark had control of everything. It was the most meticulously planned, cold-blooded abandonment I have ever witnessed. The lawyer's words painted a picture of such profound cruelty that it took my breath away. This wasn't a single act, it was a slow, 20-year campaign of erasure. The drive to Montreux was quiet. The scenery was stunningly beautiful, the placid blue of Lake Geneva on one side, steep, vineyard-covered hills on the other. It was a postcard from paradise. But for my grandfather, it had been a gilded cage. The villa was set back from the road, a handsome but modest stone house surrounded by a meticulously kept garden. It was beautiful, but it felt profoundly lonely. David led me to the front door and paused, his hand on the knob. "He is physically frail, Lily," he said gently. "And he is proud. This is not easy for him. Be patient with him." He opened the door and gestured for me to go inside. The interior was dark and cool, filled with heavy, antique furniture. And there, sitting in a wingback chair by a large window overlooking the lake, was an old man. He was thin, almost bird-like, with a shock of white hair and a face etched with the fine lines of age and worry. He was looking out the window, but he turned his head slowly as I entered. His eyes, a startlingly bright blue, widened slightly. They were my eyes. I saw my own reflection in his gaze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was filled with the weight of 2 lost decades. Then, a fragile smile touched his lips. "Lily," he whispered, his voice raspy with disuse. "You came." Tears streamed down my face as I crossed the room and knelt by his chair. I took his hand. It was cool and thin, all paper like skin and bone. "I came," I choked out. "Grandfather, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." He squeezed my hand weakly, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "It is not your fault, child," he said, his voice gaining a little strength. "It is never the child's fault. I didn't want to die before I saw my son's daughter's face. Before someone knew the truth." In that moment, kneeling on the floor of a stranger's house in a foreign country, holding the hand of the man I'd thought was dead, I felt more at home than I ever had in my father's sterile, glass house. The search was over. But the fight was just beginning. Chapter 4: Piecing Together the Truth. The days that followed were a slow, careful process of discovery. My grandfather, Samuel, was weak and his energy came in fits and starts. But his mind was as sharp as a tack. The senile, unstable man my father had described was a fiction, a convenient lie to justify his own monstrosity. Samuel Blackwood was a brilliant, thoughtful, and deeply wounded man. We spent hours in his sunroom, overlooking the lake, as he unspooled the story of the last 22 years. He told me about his early life, building a tech company from the ground up with nothing but an idea and an unshakable belief in the future. He spoke of my grandmother, who had passed away from cancer, with a love so palpable it felt like she was in the room with us. He spoke of my father, Mark, with a complex mixture of sorrow and bewilderment. "He was always ambitious," Samuel said, his gaze distant. "I thought it was a virtue. I encouraged it. I never imagined his ambition had no room for a conscience." He recounted the rest cure in excruciating detail. How Mark had been so attentive at first, assuring him it was all for his own good. He described the gradual isolation, the staff who were told not to bother him with business calls, the letters that went unanswered, the friends who were told he was too unwell for visitors. "It was like watching myself disappear in slow motion," Samuel whispered, his voice frail. "One day, I woke up and realized I was a ghost in my own life. And my son was the one holding the sheet." While Samuel provided the emotional heart of the story, David Chen provided the cold, hard facts. He had been Samuel's lawyer for 30 years, but Mark had systematically pushed him out, replacing him with a firm of his own choosing. It was only when Samuel had a health scare a year prior that he managed to get a message to David through a sympathetic nurse. Since then, David had been working in secret, digging into Mark's activities. He spread a mountain of documents across the large dining room table: bank statements, investment portfolios, deeds, and corporate filings. It was a dizzying paper trail of my father's deceit. "Mark didn't just abandon him, Lily," David explained, pointing to a highlighted column of figures. "He's been systematically liquidating Samuel's personal assets and funneling the money into his own high-risk real estate ventures under the guise of portfolio management. He used the power of attorney to bleed him dry." The documents showed shell corporations, offshore accounts, and transactions designed to be untraceable. My father hadn't just put his father on a shelf, he'd been robbing him blind for 2 decades. The most damning piece of evidence was a series of forged letters, supposedly from Samuel's doctors, detailing his rapid cognitive decline. These were the letters Mark had used to justify his total control to the banks and the original law firm. "He built his entire career, his entire life with Susan, on your grandfather's money," David said, his expression grim. "He's a parasite who has been feeding off his host for 20 years. The more I learned, the sicker I felt. My entire upbringing, the private schools, the nice house, the comfortable life my father had provided, it was all funded by his greatest crime. I was living on the proceeds of my grandfather's slow erasure." One afternoon, I found a locked trunk in the attic. Samuel gave me the key, a small, ornate brass one. "Your grandmother's things," he said softly. I could never bring myself to go through them after Mark locked them away. Inside, beneath layers of preserved clothing and photo albums, I found a box of letters. They were from my mother to Samuel, written in the years after she married my father. They were filled with a growing sense of unease. She wrote about Mark's obsession with money, his coldness, his resentment towards his brilliant father. In the last letter, written just months before she died in a car crash, her words were chilling. I fear Mark sees you not as his father, but as a rival, Samuel. He talks about your legacy as if it's already his. It scares me. He is becoming someone I don't recognize. Holding my mother's letter, I finally understood. This wasn't a recent development. The man my father had become, cold, greedy, and ruthless, had been there all along. My mother had seen it. And it had scared her. Perhaps that was the real reason my father never wanted to talk about her. She was a witness to his true character. Bringing the letters to Samuel was one of the hardest things I've ever done. He read them in silence, his hand trembling. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with a profound sadness. She knew, he whispered. Your mother was a wonderful woman. So much wiser than either of us. The letters, the financial documents, Samuel's stories, they were all individual pieces of a horrifying puzzle. And now, finally, we could see the whole picture. It was a portrait of unimaginable greed and betrayal. The truth was no longer a question. The only question left was what we were going to do about it. The need for justice burned in my chest, a cold, righteous fire. The initial rage and sorrow began to coalesce into something far more dangerous, a plan. We could have gone the simple route, a lawsuit, a public exposé. But David Chen, ever the strategist, advised against it. A legal battle would be protracted and messy, he explained one evening. The three of us gathered around the dining table that now served as our war room. Mark would paint Samuel as a vengeful, senile old man. He would use his wealth to drown us in legal fees and appeals. We need to do more than just win. We need to dismantle him. Samuel, who had seemed to regain some of his old strength in my presence, tapped a finger on the table. A spark of his former, formidable self flickered in his blue eyes. Your father is arrogant, Lily, he said, his voice surprisingly firm. His greatest weakness is his belief that he is the smartest person in any room. He believes I am a non-entity. A ghost. We will use that arrogance against him. And so, the Billionaire's Gambit was born. It was a plan audacious in its simplicity, designed to corner my father using his own greed as the bait. Step 1 was to create the illusion that Samuel was fading fast, just as Mark had always claimed. Through the same sympathetic nurse who had helped him contact David, we began leaking information. She made a few unauthorized calls to a former colleague who was known to be a gossip, mentioning Mr. Blackwood's declining health, his moments of confusion, his talk of finalizing his affairs. We knew the news would travel through the grapevine and eventually reach my father's ears. Step 2 was the bait itself. David, acting on Samuel's confused instructions, contacted my father's law firm. He explained that Mr. Blackwood, in a moment of lucidity, had demanded a change to his will. He was creating a new primary trust, one that would be managed by a Swiss banking firm, not by Mark. However, to finalize the transfer of the remaining significant assets, including the deed to the family's ancestral estate back home, it required Mark's signature in person alongside Samuel's, as stipulated by the original power of attorney agreement. He will see this as his final victory, David predicted. He will believe your grandfather is finally losing his mind completely and is about to sign over the last piece of the puzzle. The chance to get his hands on the estate, the one thing Samuel kept out of his direct control, will be irresistible to him. He will have to come here. To make the bait even more enticing, Samuel transferred a significant sum of money into a new account, a honey pot that would appear on the paperwork Mark would be shown. It would look like the grand prize. The final, crucial step was preparation. While we waited for Mark to take the bait, David worked tirelessly with a forensic accounting team to create an airtight portfolio of my father's crimes. They compiled every fraudulent transfer, every forged document, every shell corporation, into a clear, undeniable narrative of his 20-year-long theft. My role was to be the caretaker and the motivator. I spent my days with Samuel, helping him with small exercises, ensuring he ate well, and talking with him for hours about everything and nothing. I was watching him come back to life. The color returned to his cheeks. The stoop in his shoulders lessened. He was no longer just a victim, he was a fighter, preparing for the last great battle of his life. The call came 2 weeks later. It was Susan who called my father's office, her voice dripping with false sympathy, asking David about poor Samuel's condition. David played his part beautifully, sighing with weary resignation, confirming that Mr. Blackwood was very confused and that it was probably for the best to get these final matters settled. Mark got on the line and, after a few perfunctory questions, agreed to fly to Geneva the following week. "We'll be there on Thursday to sign the papers and put this sad chapter to rest," he said, his tone that of a benevolent son dealing with a difficult but necessary task. The night before they were due to arrive, the villa was quiet but electric with anticipation. Samuel, David, and I sat in the living room, the portfolio of evidence in a handsome leather-bound case on the coffee table. "Are you ready for this?" I asked my grandfather, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, and his face, which had so often been clouded with pain, was calm and resolute. "He took 20 years of my life, Lily," he said, his voice steady. "Tomorrow, I'm taking 1 day of his. And it will be the day that costs him everything." There was no glee in his voice, only a profound, steely sense of justice. The trap was set. The players were moving into position. Judgment was coming to this quiet villa on the lake. Chapter 6, Judgment Day at the Estate. Thursday arrived with a crystalline sky and a chilling breeze off the lake. The beauty of the day was a stark contrast to the tension coiled inside the villa. Samuel was dressed not in his usual comfortable loungewear, but in a perfectly tailored tweed jacket and crisp shirt. He looked like the titan of industry he once was, not the frail recluse my father believed him to be. David Chen was the picture of calm professionalism, his briefcase containing the honeypot documents resting beside him. My own heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a mixture of terror and fierce, protective determination. At exactly 11 a.m., a sleek, black rental car pulled up the driveway. My father and Susan emerged. They were dressed in expensive, somber-colored clothing, as if attending a funeral, or, more accurately, the reading of a will in their favor. Their faces were composed in masks of dutiful concern. As they walked to the door, I saw my father glance around at the property, a flicker of possessive assessment in his eyes. He already saw it as his. I opened the door before they could ring. My presence was the first crack in their composure. "Lily," my father said, his surprise evident. "What are you doing here? I told you to stay out of this." "I decided to see this sad chapter to its end," I replied, my voice cold, echoing his own words back at him. Susan shot me a venomous look before pasting on a smile and stepping inside. "Samuel, dear, we came as soon as we could," she cooed, walking towards my grandfather, who was seated in his wingback chair, appearing to look out the window. As they approached, Samuel turned his head slowly. The effect was dramatic. He wasn't the weak, confused man they expected. His eyes were clear, intelligent, and blazing with an intensity that made both of them stop dead in their tracks. "Mark." "Susan," he said, his voice not the raspy whisper of a dying man, but the resonant baritone of a CEO addressing his board. "How good of you to come all this way to witness the end." My father recovered quickly, forcing a laugh. "Father, you're looking well. We were so worried." "Were you?" Samuel asked, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "Please, sit. Mr. Chen has the documents ready for our final transaction." He gestured to the dining table. Mark and Susan exchanged a quick, triumphant glance and sat down. This was it. The final victory lap. David opened his briefcase and laid out the trust documents, a thick stack of papers culminating in a signature page. As you can see, David began, the final trust transfers all of Mr. Blackwood's remaining global assets, including the Blackwood estate, into a new holding company. It requires both of your signatures to execute. Mark eagerly picked up a pen, barely glancing at the preceding pages. His eyes were fixed on the prize. Of course, he said briskly. Whatever makes him comfortable. He signed his name with a flourish. He slid the document over to Samuel. Samuel did not pick up the pen. Instead, he looked directly at my father. Before I sign, he said, his voice dangerously quiet, I have a question for you, Mark. When you told everyone I was dead, did you feel anything at all? A flicker of guilt? Sadness? Or was it just relief? My father froze, the pen still in his hand. I don't know what you're talking about. You've been unwell. Have I? Samuel replied. Because my memory seems to be quite clear. On that cue, David reached back into his briefcase. But this time, he did not pull out financial documents. He pulled out the thick, leather-bound portfolio of evidence. He opened it and turned it to face Mark and Susan. This is a forensic audit of your management of your father's accounts for the past 22 years, David said, his voice like steel. He began to flip the pages, each one detailing a crime. Shell Corporation in the Cayman Islands, established to purchase a property for yourself in Aspen. Forged medical letters to Bank of Zurich to justify asset liquidation. A systematic siphoning of over $200 million into your personal and business accounts. With each page, the color drained further from Mark's face. Susan looked like she was going to be physically sick. This is ridiculous, Mark stammered, trying to bluster his way through. These are fabrications. Are they? I asked, stepping forward. I placed the box of my mother's letters on the table. My mother saw what you were becoming. She wrote about it. She was scared of you. I slid the last, damning letter in front of him. His eyes darted to the familiar handwriting, and a strangled sound escaped his throat. It was the one piece of evidence he could never have anticipated. Samuel leaned forward. You didn't come here to get my signature, Mark. You came here to be served. David slid another document across the table. It wasn't a trust agreement. It was a notice of a civil lawsuit for fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse, seeking damages for the full amount stolen, plus punitive damages that would utterly bankrupt him. Simultaneously, David placed a small digital recorder on the table. And this entire conversation, including your admission that you came here to sign what you believed were documents from a mentally incompetent man, has been recorded. The authorities will be very interested in that. My father stared at the papers, at the recorder, at his father's implacable face. The world he had built on a foundation of lies was collapsing in on him in real time. He looked from me to Samuel, his expression one of pure, unadulterated hatred. Susan began to sob, a pathetic, gulping sound. You, my father snarled, his voice trembling with rage, pointing a shaking finger at me. This is your fault. No, Samuel said, his voice booming in the silent room. This is your fault. This is the consequence of a choice you made 2 decades ago. He finally picked up the pen. But he didn't sign the trust. He took a new document David provided, a completely restructured will, and signed it, with David and me as witnesses. In it, he disinherited Mark completely and named me the sole heir and executor of his entire, recovered estate. The judgment was delivered. The gavel had fallen. The aftermath was not a fiery explosion, but a slow, complete collapse. Faced with the mountain of undeniable evidence and the threat of criminal charges, my father crumbled. There was no fight left in him. He and Susan left the villa that day as ghosts, their faces pale and their futures obliterated. The lawsuit proceeded, and it was a slaughter. They didn't even contest it. The court froze all their assets. The glass house in the suburbs was sold. Their cars were repossessed. Their names, once fixtures in the society pages, were now whispered in gossip columns, synonymous with scandal and disgrace. Mark Carter, the financial guru, was exposed as a common thief who had stolen from his own father. It was a fall from grace so total, so absolute, that there was no coming back. I never spoke to him again. I received one text message a few weeks after that day in Switzerland. It just said, "I hope you're happy." I didn't reply. Happiness wasn't the goal. Justice was. And what came after justice was something quieter and more profound. I stayed in Switzerland with Samuel. The months that followed were a period of healing. With the weight of his long fight lifted, my grandfather seemed to age in reverse. He gained weight, his laughter became more frequent, and the light returned to his eyes. We walked by the lake, we shared meals, and we talked for hours on end. He taught me about his business, not the numbers and figures, but the passion for innovation that had driven him. I told him about my quiet life, my love for history, for the tangible connection to the past. He listened with an intensity and respect my father had never shown me. He didn't see my passion as a quaint hobby, he saw it as the heart of a storyteller, an archivist of truth. He asked me to take over the Blackwood Foundation, a philanthropic organization he had founded years ago, which my father had allowed to languish. The foundation's mission was to fund historical preservation projects and provide scholarships for students in the humanities. It was as if he had looked into my soul and found the perfect role for me. It was a legacy I was proud to inherit. We decided, together, that Samuel would not return home to live. Switzerland was his home now. He had found peace in his quiet villa by the lake. But he wanted to see the ancestral estate one last time. A few months later, we flew back together. Walking into the old house, the one Mark had been so desperate to possess, felt like closing a circle. It was a beautiful home, full of memories, but it was also just a building. Our family, the real family, was not a place or a name, but the bond that had been forged in the fire of betrayal and rediscovered across a continent. We sold the estate. We sold all the trappings of the life my father had built. The money was funneled back into the foundation, where it could do some good in the world, washing away the stain of how it had been managed for the past 2 decades. My new life is one I could never have imagined. I travel between my small apartment in the city and the villa in Montreux. I manage the foundation, poring over grant applications, helping to preserve the very kind of histories I once so lovingly catalogued. I am no longer just an observer of stories, I am a part of one. A grand, complicated, and ultimately hopeful story. I found more than just justice. I found a grandfather, a mentor, and a friend. I found a connection to my mother and a purpose that resonates deep within me. The revenge was not the end goal, it was the act of clearing the rubble. What we built afterward, my grandfather and I, is a new legacy. It is a legacy founded not on wealth or power, but on truth, resilience, and the quiet, enduring strength of a family that refused to be erased.